The streets of Germany in the early 1930s were a grim tapestry of despair, woven with threads of poverty, humiliation, and rage. The Treaty of Versailles had left the nation broken, its pride shattered, its economy in ruins. The people wandered like ghosts through cities that once pulsed with life, their faces gaunt, their spirits crushed. Unemployment soared, hunger gnawed at families, and the future seemed like a distant, unattainable dream. In this abyss of hopelessness, a man emerged, his voice a thunderous roar, his promises a seductive whisper. His name was Adolf Hitler, and his rise to power was not a triumph of democracy, but a descent into darkness. Now, before I move on, YouTube is not very kind to content it considers political or even historical. The algorithm overlords prefer cat videos, I guess. A like, a subscribe or a comment goes a long way getting past the algorithm's bias. That's it, so without further delay let's move on with the story. The Weimar Republic, fragile and fractured, was a house of cards teetering on the edge of collapse. The politicians, spineless and self-serving, bickered in their ivory towers, blind to the storm gathering outside. They were men of compromise, of half measures, their hands trembling as they signed away the future of a nation. They saw Hitler and his Nazi party as a fringe movement, a rabble that could be controlled or ignored. They underestimated the hunger of the people, the desperation that made them cling to anyone who promised salvation. And so, they allowed the wolf into the fold, believing they could tame him. They were wrong. The SA, Hitler's brown-shirted stormtroopers, were the foot soldiers of this new order. They marched through the streets with a brutal efficiency, their boots pounding like the drums of war. They were not soldiers, they were thugs, enforcers, the embodiment of intimidation. They broke into homes in the dead of night, dragging out anyone who dared to speak against the party. The screams of the beaten echoed through the alleys, a grim symphony of terror. The SA's violence was not random, it was calculated, a weapon to silence dissent and crush opposition. They patrolled the streets like predators, their presence a constant reminder that resistance was futile. The people learned to lower their eyes, to whisper their fears, to live in the shadow of fear. The press, once a pillar of democracy, was systematically dismantled. Newspapers that criticized the Nazis were raided, their offices ransacked, their presses destroyed. Editors and journalists were arrested, beaten, or simply disappeared. The remaining papers became mouthpieces for the regime, their headlines screaming propaganda, their pages filled with lies. The truth was buried under a mountain of hate and fear. Radio broadcasts were censored, books burned, and voices of dissent silenced. The Nazis understood the power of information, and they wielded it like a weapon. The people were fed a diet of fear and hatred, their minds poisoned by the venom of propaganda. And then there were the Jews. They became the scapegoats for every ill that plagued the nation. Hitler's speeches were a torrent of hate, his words dripping with venom as he blamed the Jews for the economic collapse, for the humiliation of Versailles, for the very decay of Germany itself. The people, desperate for someone to blame, clung to his words like a lifeline. Hatred festered, spreading like a disease. Jewish businesses were boycotted, their storefronts smeared with slogans of hate. Their homes were vandalized, their synagogues desecrated. The streets ran with the ink of shattered windows and the blood of the innocent. The Jews were not just enemies, they were sacrifices on the altar of a new Germany. The Treaty of Versailles, a symbol of shame and subjugation, became Hitler's rallying cry. He spoke of its chains, of the betrayal of the weak and the cowardly. He promised to tear it apart, to restore Germany to its former glory. The people, hungry for vengeance, roared their approval. They did not see the chains he would replace it with, the iron grip of a regime that would strip them of their freedom, their dignity, their humanity. Hitler's vision was not one of liberation, but of domination. He spoke of strength, of unity, of a new order, but his words were a mask for tyranny. By 1933, the pieces were in place. The spineless politicians, too weak to stand against the tide, handed Hitler the keys to power. The Reichstag fire, a blaze of chaos and conspiracy, became the pretext for the Enabling Act, a law that gave Hitler dictatorial powers. The democracy of the Weimar Republic was dismantled, brick by brick, until nothing remained but the facade. The SA, now an unstoppable force, enforced the will of the regime with brutal efficiency. The press was a puppet, its strings pulled by the Nazis. The Jews were hunted, their fate sealed. And the Treaty of Versailles, once a symbol of defeat, was overshadowed by a far greater horror. The darkness had won. Germany was no longer a nation of hope, but a machine of oppression. The people, once desperate for salvation, now lived in fear of their savior. The streets were silent, the air heavy with the stench of despair. And in the heart of it all, Adolf Hitler stood, his eyes burning with a fire that would consume the world. The rise was complete. The nightmare had begun. But this was only the beginning. The world would soon learn the true cost of Hitler's promises, the true depth of his darkness. The streets of Germany, once filled with the cries of the desperate, would echo with the footsteps of the doomed. The shadow that fell over the nation would stretch across the globe, a harbinger of the horrors to come. The rise of Hitler was not just the fall of Germany, it was the beginning of a darkness that would scar the world forever. Please help a small channel grow, like and subscribe.